Hi, I'm Gary White with Channel 6, Central Kentucky Television. I'm here with State Senator Jimmy Higdon with the 14th District, which includes Marion and Nelson counties here in Central Kentucky. And we are talking about the legislative session that passed earlier this year, but there are several issues that are just going into effect now, and part of one of the bills that was discussed, that we've been discussing, I think, the whole time that you've been a representative and now a senator, is tax reform for a year.
You are correct. We've had that discussion every single year when you ask what the priorities for the next year were. Tax reform was always on the list, and my legislative surveys that I put out, most years I'd have about tax reform. And so it's been talked about, really, Gary, all the way back when I ran for office in 2002, the state had commissioned a Dr. Fox, a nationally known tax expert from Tennessee, to do a review of Kentucky's tax code. And it was nicknamed the Fox Report. And it was issued in 2002. And you know, I've read that several times, but it looked at Kentucky, it looked at basically four taxes that we have in Kentucky. Sales tax, property tax, personal income tax, and corporate income tax. And what it found when it compared us to our surrounding states, that our property tax was relatively low, that our sales tax was relatively low, and that our income tax and corporate income tax were higher than the surrounding states. So the recommendation by Dr. Fox at the time, he encouraged Kentucky to move away from a production tax, which is an income tax, to a consumption tax, which is tax on services and things that people consume. And that was a recommendation, and we look around at Kentucky, we try to compare ourselves to other states, and we look at those states that are doing very well financially and growth-wise. You look to Tennessee, it has a zero personal income tax. Texas, zero personal income tax. And Florida, zero personal income tax. I don't think Kentucky, be realistic, Kentucky could never get to zero personal income tax because we would have to tax food and medicine. I just don't see us doing that in Kentucky. But that's what you'd have to do to get to a zero personal income tax. But Tennessee is at 3.5%. We could potentially get to there. So that's what we talked about, or that's what was talked about in 2002. There was a blue ribbon task force put together in 2012, and again, a report from Dr. Fox. And he recommended then, he says Kentucky's, sales tax revenues are growing very slowly. And if we don't move to a segment of the economy that's growing, if we don't move away from our dependence on just the production or income tax, that Kentucky was facing, and I think he said by 2020, $1 billion shortfall with the amount of, with the, I guess, growth of the rate of growth, looking at the rate of growth, and Kentucky's tax code not keeping up, that we were looking at $1 billion shortfall. That was in 2012, and of course every year we look at it. Every year we looked at pension reform, and we just again, it's a very difficult task. It's a very difficult subject, and we shied away from it. But there's my dad always taught me that one of the very basic principles of a grown-up is to pay your bills. And so Kentucky, we had to pay our bills, and we had a choice, and what we've done in the past, we've underfunded the pension plans and avoided any. We've made a lot of cuts to government, but we've avoided really serious cuts by not properly funding our pension system. So in 2000, we talked about this earlier. In 2014, because of Senate Bill 2 that we passed in 2013, we were required to make the full amount to KERS. So in 2014, we put in an additional $1 billion into the pension system, 5% of our budget. In 2016, when Governor Bevin came in and was determined to fully fund the pensions, we put in a additional $2.3 billion. That was the first time since 2008 that we made an ARC payment to teachers' retirement. We put $500 million in each year to TRS in 2016, and that bumped us up to an additional $2.3 billion, or 10% of our budget. This budget that we just passed, we went to level dollar funding for KERS, which was additional $700 million a year. And Senate Bill 151 put in an actuarially required contribution to teachers' retirement, which was $500 million in each year. And so we put in an additional $3.3 billion in this budget, $3.3 billion, 15% of our budget to pensions. And in 2020, in our next budget, we've also, in Senate Bill 151, has committed, or that we made a commitment that we go to level dollar funding for teachers' retirement. And that's additional $400 million a year. So that will put us at $4.2 billion in additional pension contributions above the normal cost, what we actually contribute for pensions. 20% of our budget, 20% of our budget going to, not for current pensions, but to pay that unfunded liability, which is somewhere between 30 and $50 billion, depends who you ask. That was a huge commitment to do that. And in the governor's budget, he did fund all those commitments to make all those payments, but he made huge cuts to education and other places in the budget. So, we had a choice to make to, fully fund pensions, which we were committed to do, and take the cuts in education and across the other places that the governor was recommended to take them. We looked at what it would take. It was going to take an additional about $300 million to do what we needed to do. And we needed additional revenue. So that's when we decided to start the process to a consumption-based tax system away from the production type tax system. So we reduced the personal income tax by 1%. So folks getting their paychecks over the next few weeks should see that the amount that's taken out for the state, it will be reduced from 6% to 5%. So their take home should be 1% more because of that deduction. And we reduced corporate income tax from 6% to 5%. And then we also did a 50-cent increase in the cigarette tax, which really I don't think there's anybody happy with that. The smokers are unhappy with the increase, and those health advocates that have been lobbying us for years to raise the tax a lot higher than that, they were very unhappy that we only raised it 50 cents. So, but anyway, there was an increase in the cigarette tax of 50 cents, and then we spread out. You've heard people talk about the $13 billion in exemptions we have in Kentucky. Well, a lot of those are sales tax exemptions, that $13 billion, and the biggest part of that, or a good part of that, is exemptions for food and medicine. That's a big part of that. But there's a lot of services that are exempt too. So we got a list of services that was provided to us and this was the legislative intent, and we'll talk about that later. the legislative intent, what actually is happening is not exactly the one and the same. But we were told when we voted on the list of things that we will, tax that haven't been taxed before, that all these facilities or all these businesses were currently collecting tax. Like we put, extended the sales tax to auto repair. But when you go get your car worked on, you were paying tax on the parts.
Right.
So that auto dealer or that garage was already collecting sales tax and reporting it. And so that's what we were told. We weren't going to tax anybody that was not currently collecting a tax. We put tax on landscaping, and landscapers typically are that person that comes and sells you shrubs and trees. They collect sales tax on those shrubs and trees, but not the labor. But we extended it to the labor.
So you wouldn't have encumbered businesses with a new expense of having to add their software tax.
That was the legislative intent. That's not exactly what happened. We exempted cosmetologists, hairdressers, and barbers because they, most of them, they sell products, but they pay tax on their products when they buy them, so they don't have to deal with sales tax. So we exempted them, and but like I said, as we move forward, as we're here now, or as the bureaucrats take what we passed and interpret what we passed, things have changed quite a bit, and so we have some unintended consequences. Another unintended consequence, right after we passed this legislation, the Kentucky Supreme Court rendered a decision that it was Grand Lodge versus the city of Taylor Mill. And what that was, it was a nursing home owned by the Masons, and Taylor Mill sued them for tax that the residents living there were paying, and they end up winning that lawsuit. The city of Taylor Mill did, and what the Kentucky Supreme Court said, that Kentucky's law for nonprofits only excludes nonprofits from paying property tax. It does not exclude them from collecting sales tax, which is a sea change, because all nonprofits have always considered they didn't have to pay tax and they didn't have to collect tax. So what we're seeing after that court decision, and the Revenue Cabinet has interpreted that, the House Bill 433, I believe is the number. They have interpreted that to tax stuff like memberships to the YMCA. That was never the legislative intent. Also, it will tax ticket sales, or if you buy a ticket to go see a UK or U of L basketball game, you will have to pay tax on that now in the future, because typically they were nonprofit and they were exempt from paying sales tax. But again, that was not the legislative intent for that to happen. So some of these things will be revisited next year when we go back, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of interesting conversation about some of the things that are included in this bill. And again, not all of it was a legislative intent.
Yeah. So like different organizations that are nonprofits, for instance, the theater group here in Lebanon, now when you buy a ticket there or at an opera house in Springfield, whatever, they have to charge a sales tax.
And that was never the legislative intent. That was a Supreme Court decision that says that nonprofits are not exempt from collecting sales tax. So, and that happened after we passed this bill, which was a shock to everyone that the Supreme Court ruled that way. I don't know that any nonprofits will take that all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, but right now the Kentucky Supreme Court. That's the highest authority in Kentucky.
Right.
And they say that nonprofits have to collect sales tax. So yes, the theater group here in Lebanon and will have to collect sales tax.
Yeah. Speaking of Supreme Court, though, on another thing, the U.S. Supreme Court also, I think, since then, has now decided that it is legal for states to charge sales tax on stuff bought over the internet. So that could potentially have a positive impact.
That's
is that correct?
That's correct. You know, the U.S. Supreme Court visited that issue 15 years ago, and they didn't hear it. They sent it back to the states and said that, you know, nobody taxes things the same. You know, you got to get your act together, because a retailer in Delaware would never know how to tax things in Kentucky. Yeah, mm-hmm. So they would never, you know, understand Kentucky. What they came up with was an issue they called streamlined sales tax, mm-hmm. And it was and we passed it in Kentucky. We were one of the, I think, 30 or 35 states that are part of the streamlined sales tax. And so what that does, a merchant in another community could look at a chart. They could look up Kentucky, and under the streamlined sales tax, they would see that clothing in Kentucky is taxed at 6%, or water in Kentucky is not taxed. Food in Kentucky is not taxed. You know, guns and ammunition is taxed. You know, tires are taxed. You know, it would see all the things. When they look up Kentucky, a merchant anywhere in the country could look up Kentucky and see what we tax and what we don't. Mm-hmm. And Kentucky is a member of that. And so, you know, we're set up to be able to do that. And you know, there's still a lot of logistics to that happening, and but that now is the law of the land. And yes, Kentucky can start collecting sales tax on out-of-state vendors who currently don't have a physical presence in Kentucky. Now, right. We've been fortunate here in Kentucky that Amazon has a physical presence. Amazon has been collecting sales tax for Kentucky for quite some time, and that's good. And even though Kentucky law, Gary, says that when you and I or anybody else buys something on the internet, we're responsible to submit the sales tax to the state of Kentucky, which very few people realize that, and very few people do that. But that it has been the law for years. Right.
Now, actually, maybe processed by somebody else, so make it easier for the consumer.
Right. And so, you know, estimates a few years ago that we were losing anywhere between $300 and $500 million a year to internet sales. And you and I both know, and the statistics prove it, that internet sales continue to grow. And that's one of the problems with our current taxing system, is that it's not growing with the economy. And you look at our personal income tax over the years, it has increased very, with the economy. But you look at our sales tax, and the growth on sales tax has been almost flat. It increases a little bit every year, but we haven't had any drastic increases in our sales tax. And well, not drastic increases, but sales tax hasn't grown with the economy. Yeah. And so.
But there's a potential windfall there if you could get between $300 and $500 million. So wait and see.
And that will help us in our next step if we try to, as we want to reduce the personal income tax again. Like I said, right now we've reduced it from 6% to 5%. I would really like to see us get to where Indiana is at 3.5%. And I think it gives people control of, if you have a payroll deduction and your employer's holding that money out of that state tax out of your check, you really have no control over that. No matter how much you make, the state's going to take their cut. But with a consumption tax, as you lower your personal income tax, you have more money in your pocket and you can decide on, or at least a decision on where you spend your money. That's kind of the philosophy behind a consumption tax. And it's a painful conversion, Gary. It's to go from primarily taxing production to taxing additional items, taxing services, and most states are doing that now. And again, though, it's not a seamless process. It's going to take a while to get used to it.
And those service taxes that went into effect July 1st, correct? Mm-hmm. For all these different new taxes that went into effect as of July 1st. So you may see an increase or whatever. However, those businesses are going to handle it, whether they've anybody with a sales tax number has been notified that of the changes. Mm-hmm. And again, the interpretation, the way the Revenue Cabinet interpreted it, the legislative intent was that no merchant would have to collect sales tax unless they were already collecting tax, or required to collect a sales tax already. But the Revenue Cabinet did not interpret it that way, and so there's going to be additional services. Perfect example, landscaping. The legislative intent was, and again, we were told that, and the legislative intent was that landscapers, somebody who sowed shrubbery or flowers or whatever, and that they were already collecting sales tax. Mm-hmm. Their labor for installation or doing landscaping at a home would be taxed. And that was the legislative intent. The Revenue Cabinet had interpreted that completely different, and they've also included lawn mowing in the as a taxable item, and that was not the legislative intent. And like I said, we'll be revisiting this, and when we get back into session again, and the General Assembly will, so this is why it's taken 20 years or whatever for tax reform to get to this point. Like I said, the first report, the first recommendation was in, that study was started in 2000, released in 2002, so almost 20 years. Almost 20 years. And so you're saying this is potentially the first step, so you see this evolving process for tax reform over the next few cycles? I think so. One of the things you look at states like Tennessee and Indiana, and look at their taxing code and how they're generating revenue and trying to they're rated, both Tennessee and Indiana are rated as low tax states. Even though Tennessee has zero personal income tax, their sales tax is 9.75%. And a lot of Kentuckians pay that when they go visit Gatlinburg or Nashville, or so their sales tax is very high, but they're still rated as a low tax state. And as we look and try to be more like them, you look to Kansas, who tried the same thing, but they try to get to zero too fast, and they ran into some real problems. So we'd like to do a gradual process, a little bit at a time, to make sure this is where we want to go, and that we get there without any unintended consequences. Because again, it's a sea change, and it's a difference in philosophy, going from that tax and production, which we have dropped that. Everyone should see a difference in the amount of taxes as withheld from their paycheck, or what they had to pay into the Kentucky Revenue Cabinet, but it would be reduced from 6% to 5%. There's also a clause in there, Gary, that anyone who makes under 130% of poverty, which is $15,000 for individual and $25,000 for a family of four, they will basically be exempt from income tax under this plan. Okay. Yes, because sometimes that can be an argument as well, that if you go to a consumption tax, it's burdening people who make less money more than the individuals who are making more money, going away from income to consumption.
And one of the philosophies is the more you make, the more you spend, and the more consumption tax you would pay. And I understand that argument. I'm just you look at I've looked at the Tennessee and Indiana. I like the comparison to those two states because they're right here. We can see they're neighbors, and the poverty levels in Tennessee and Indiana are much lower than Kentucky's. But Kentucky is unique. We're very unique with the amount of people that are in poverty in Kentucky.
So again, these taxes go into effect as of July 1st. But also, we want to touch upon really quickly as well, another issue that has come up with the legislature is the Medicare issue, and with the waivers and the speaking of the poverty issue here too. Can you tell us a little about what's going on with that and what's happened recently?
And I can't tell you the exact year that Kentucky implemented the expanded Medicaid. It was under Governor Beshear. I want to say that happened in 2010, 2012. I really that's foggy on exactly when we implemented the Affordable Care Act and expanded Medicaid in Kentucky. But right now we've expanded that, and the studies show that one in three Kentuckians are on Medicaid. And of course, Governor Bevin and the state of Kentucky applied for a waiver to allow Kentucky to have a work requirement, that if you were able-bodied and on Medicaid, that you would be required to either learn a skill or do volunteer work, or you'd be required to do something 20 hours a week. And that was for able-bodied individuals. And I think between 18, there's an age there, as long as they, if they had children or they were caring for an elderly person, or some disqualifying event or that didn't make them qualify for the work requirement. But anyway, that was struck down by a federal judge as being unconstitutional. Now, the thing about the interesting part about that, Gary, is that Kentucky did the Medicaid expansion just with a executive order from the governor. So it's not legislated. It's just, like I said, an executive order. So that could be struck down by the current governor.
Right.
And since it was never legislated. So that's the interesting part of this, that the governor has said that he will eliminate the expanded Medicaid if this waiver doesn't go through. But there will be an appeal, and the appeals process is not going to be as swift as the appeal process for Senate Bill 151. It could take years for that to make it to the U.S. Supreme Court. Other states are kind of waiting and seeing what happens with Kentucky, because a lot of other states have applied for a waiver to require a work requirement for Medicaid. But that's one of the things that every year that when we do our budget, that's one of the things that one of the expenses that's very difficult to control. If somebody qualifies for Medicaid, we don't have the option of budgeting so much money, and when it runs out, it runs out. If somebody qualifies for Medicaid, we have to pay, like if it's expanded Medicaid, we have to pay our 10%. If it's regular Medicaid, we have to pay 30% of that bill. So that's a big hit to our budget. But again, like I said, 1 in 3 people are covered by Medicaid, and that's the expanded Medicaid. The ones that we're paying the 10% on it's in excess of 500,000 people. I don't know the exact number, But it would be a real crisis if something happens to that. Just boom, it's gone.
Right.
Without any type of phase into that at all. It would be.
So there's 500,000 for the expanded.
Yeah, if it was simply cut off, and I don't see that happening. But again, that's a possibility because expanded Medicaid was adopted by Governor Beshear by executive order. So Governor Bevin, by executive order, can eliminate it, and
right. And that's what he threatened to do if what happened happened.
That's what he's talked about doing, and I've seen 2 or 3 different assumptions, and so
wait and see.
We'll have to wait and see, and you know I'm not really sure. I don't keep track a whole lot of the how federal judicial system works. I know that was a one judge that ruled it unconstitutional, and I'm not sure if that goes to the Court of Appeals. Mm-hmm. I know there's several stops it has to make right. before it gets to the Supreme Court, and I feel like this case will make it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I don't know if Kentucky be the one that pursues it or not, but it is something that a lot of states have been looking to attempt, and so we'll see how that works out. It's like I said, it's in the hands of the judiciary. And
right. How many people, do you have an estimate as to how many individuals would be affected with the waiver? So if there were like 500,000 and expanded currently, how many would potentially have to either work or to keep it, or were there numbers for that?
I've seen numbers on that, Gary, that people anticipate could possibly lose their coverage if they didn't comply. Sure. But I don't remember exactly what those statistics are, and you never know. They're just estimates. You never know if they're high or low. I do agree with the one thing that we need to encourage people to go to work. In this country and in this state, we've encouraged people a lot that we make it very easy for them not to work, and so I think this is a good step forward to one of the things is they can get job training. They can, and I think the workforce development, there's a plan to send them to the career centers and try to find them training, mm-hmm. and try to get them prepared to enter the workforce. So it's not totally a bad thing, because we have our labor participation rate, like I said, is way below the national average, and we have people that are not working, and we have jobs available. Just in Marion County, I hear constantly that the industries here and Nelson County and even in Washington County, where we have a strong presence, there's jobs available if somebody wants to work. So we need to encourage those. And maybe that might be the way to get someone to, go seek some training to learn a skill.
Well, again, we'll keep you up to date on what's going on with that as well. So lots of things seem to be evolving, but that's what the legislature is all about, I guess, right? So I've been talking with State Senator Jimmy Higdon for the 14th District here on Channel 6 Central Kentucky Television. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, and let me explain that this new proposal that went into effect, this expansion of the consumption tax in Kentucky, mm-hmm. and also to remind folks that not only is there an increase in sales tax on some services, there's also a reduction in the personal income tax, and I think that's an important point to make, that there is a reduction in the personal income tax. Now, I won't try to spin this by expanding the base on the consumption tax. We will generate additional revenue. That is for sure. And like I said, we had to generate additional revenue to make these pension payments that we've obligated ourselves to make. If we didn't have the additional revenue, we would have to make some severe cuts to education and places where, we just really don't feel like it's appropriate at this time to make deep cuts, especially to education, because we've got to make sure that our youngsters receive a good education. And one of the things that several of the things the governor had cut was transportation dollars. They reduced the amount that we gave schools for transportation, which really put local school districts in a bind. We had reduced the money to local school districts to pay teachers' insurance. That was put local school districts in a bind, and we also didn't foot the bill for retiree health insurance. And there was another list of things like the Friskies, school resource centers, Read to Achieve, and some of those programs have been very helpful and very productive. They had also not been funded. So with this budget, it allows us to do both things that we need to do: fully fund our pensions and to fund education. And one of the requests that I've got over and over again is the big funding to education is a SEEK formula, and ask us not to cut the amount that the SEEK formula, and which we didn't. We increased it, and it's more than it's ever been, so we did do some good things in this budget, but again, we had to have additional revenue, and so tough decisions, and like I said, it's it would have been real easy not to do anything, but I wasn't. I don't think my constituents sent me to Frankfurt to take the easy way out, and I was sent to make tough decisions, and that's what we've done, Gary. And like I said, and I'm sure there's unintended consequences in this legislation. I will hear about that, and we have next year to work on that, and also we'll be waiting anxiously to see what happens with Senate Bill 151, to see if the courts uphold the judge's ruling or rule against the judge. And either way, we probably, if he rules against the Senate Bill 151, then we have to revisit it next session. We'll probably want to revisit the way we do legislation the next session, even if the judge says that it's constitutional. I have a feeling that's going to be something that people want to see, and I'd be glad to support some changes in the legislative process. So, and then we'll see, kind of keep a watch and see what happens with the Medicaid expansion and what the governor does with that.
Sounds good. Again, this has been Gary White, Channel 6 Central Kentucky Television, here with State Senator Jimmy Higdon. You can contact Mr. Higdon if you have any kind of comments that you'd like to make as well. We'll have some information for you to do that. So,
yeah. Well, thank you, Gary, and thank Channel 6 for allowing me to do this. I know it's I get comments when I'm out that they've seen me on Channel 6, and they appreciate how you and I kind of explain the process and what's going on. So hopefully I haven't talked this to death and we haven't put anybody to sleep.
Very informative.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.